Dinner had barely ended when I noticed something wasn't right. She seemed distant, like her mind was somewhere else entirely. Trying to keep things light, I asked if everything was okay, figuring I'd hear a complaint about work or something minor. But instead, she paused. Her eyes locked onto mine with a seriousness that sent an uneasy chill through me. Then came the words that no one ever wants to hear: "We need to talk." I can recall every single detail of that moment. The way her hands nervously toyed with the hem of her shirt, the slight tremor in her voice, and the deafening silence that hung in the air after she spoke. My chest tightened as if bracing for impact, but nothing could have prepared me for the bombshell she dropped next. "I've met someone," she said. Her tone was calm and deliberate, but her words hit me like a sledgehammer. "He's the man of my dreams, and I'm moving in with him." At first, I thought she was messing with me, maybe testing my reaction with some kind of cruel, sarcastic scenario. I even let out a small laugh, thinking she'd crack a smile and admit it was all a bad joke. But her face remained stone-cold serious. She wasn't kidding. She meant it. The emotions hit me all at once, like a tidal wave crashing over my head: shock, disbelief, anger, and heartbreak all tangled together. My brain scrambled to make sense of what she'd just said. "What are you talking about? Who is this guy? And what about us?" The questions came pouring out of me, but her expression told me she already had the answers ready, like she'd been rehearsing this conversation for weeks. She went on to explain how they met at a mutual friend's party, how they hit it off immediately, and how she'd been waiting for something to change between us but never seeing it happen. This man, she said, made her feel alive in ways I apparently never had. Each word she spoke was like a knife twisting deeper into my chest. We had been married for 6 years. 6 years. I thought we were solid, maybe not perfect, but happy enough. Sure, like any couple, we had our ups and downs, but I never once thought she was so unhappy she'd do something like this. She didn't stop there. She laid it all out: how she'd been planning this for weeks, how some of her things were already packed, and how she'd arranged to move out by the weekend. The calm, almost clinical way she delivered the news was what cut the deepest. It was as though she had already checked out emotionally, and I was just another item on her to-do list. I sat there, unable to speak, my mind racing to piece together how everything could fall apart so completely without me even noticing. And then came the final blow. "You'll always be a great guy," she said, her voice softer now, as if that would somehow cushion the blow, "but he's the one I've been waiting for." My throat tightened. I couldn't even muster a response. I just sat there, frozen, as she stood, hesitated for a moment, and then walked out of the room. The sound of her footsteps fading down the hallway echoed like a death knell for our marriage. That night, sleep didn't come. I sat on the couch, replaying every word she said, every expression on her face, over and over. How could she do this to me? How could she so easily dismantle everything we'd built together? But the question that haunted me the most wasn't why she chose him. It was how I never saw it coming. The days that followed blurred together. True to her word, she started packing her things almost immediately. Watching her box up her clothes and gather her belongings was excruciating. Each item she folded felt like a piece of my life being taken away, leaving behind an empty space where our marriage had once been. She wasn't outright cruel about it. If anything, she was strangely civil, offering explanations I didn't ask for and reassurances I didn't need, or want. "You'll move on too," she said once, as if that would somehow make it better. I didn't bother responding. What was there to say? Her actions had already spoken volumes, far louder than any hollow words could. When she finally left, the house felt alien. It wasn't just the missing items, the half-empty closet or the cleared-out bathroom shelves, it was the overwhelming quiet. The silence seemed almost alive, pressing down on me with its weight. Every small sound, the creak of the floorboards, the hum of the fridge, felt like it amplified the emptiness she left behind. Dinner was barely over when I noticed something was off. She seemed distant, like her thoughts were somewhere far away. Trying to break through the tension, I asked if everything was okay, expecting her to mention something minor, maybe a bad day at work or a small annoyance. Instead, she paused, looked me dead in the eye with an intensity that made my stomach twist, and said, "We need to talk." I can recall every detail of that moment like it just happened. Her hands nervously played with the hem of her shirt, her voice carried a slight tremble, and an unbearable silence followed her words. My heart started pounding as if preparing me for something terrible, but no amount of preparation could have braced me for what she was about to say. "I've met someone," she began, her voice steady and deliberate, each word hitting me like a wrecking ball. "He's the man of my dreams, and I'm moving in with him." For a second, I thought it had to be some kind of joke, a cruel, twisted joke. I even chuckled nervously, waiting for her to roll her eyes or say, "Just kidding." But her face stayed serious, unwavering. She wasn't joking. She meant it. What followed was an avalanche of emotions, shock, confusion, anger, and heartache, all at once. My mind scrambled, desperately trying to grasp what was happening. "What do you mean? Who is this guy? What about us?" I asked, the words tumbling out of me without pause. She didn't hesitate, though. It was as if she'd practiced this conversation 100 times. She calmly explained how they'd met at a mutual friend's party, how their connection had been instant, and how she'd spent years holding back with me, hoping things would change. But with him, she said, everything felt alive in ways she claimed she never felt with me. Every word cut deeper, like a knife being twisted in my chest. "We'd been married for 6 years. 6 years. I thought we were doing okay, not perfect, sure, but solid. Like any couple, we had our ups and downs, but never once did I think she was so unhappy that she'd do something like this." Then she dropped another bombshell. She told me this wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. She'd been planning it for weeks. Some of her things were already packed, and she'd made arrangements to move out by the weekend. What rattled me most wasn't even her words, it was the calm, detached way she said them. It felt like she had already left emotionally, and I was just the last loose end she needed to tie up. I just sat there, frozen, trying to wrap my head around how everything could have unraveled without me seeing it. And then she delivered the final blow. "You'll always be a great guy," she said, as if that was supposed to ease the sting, "but he's the one I've been waiting for." I couldn't respond. My throat felt like it was closing up, my chest heavy with the weight of her words. She stood, hesitated for a moment, and then walked out of the room. The sound of her footsteps retreating down the hallway echoed like a nail being driven into the coffin of our marriage. That night, sleep didn't come. I sat on the couch, staring into the darkness, replaying her words over and over, trying to make sense of it. How could she do this? How could she dismantle everything we'd built together so casually? But the question that haunted me the most wasn't why she chose him, it was how I hadn't seen it coming. The next few days passed in a fog. True to her word, she started packing immediately. Watching her methodically fold clothes and box up her belongings felt like torture. With every item she packed, it felt like another piece of my life was being torn away, leaving behind nothing but an empty shell of what once was. To her credit, she wasn't overtly cruel. She kept things civil, offering explanations I hadn't asked for and reassurances I didn't want to hear. "You'll move on too," she said one day, as if those words were supposed to provide comfort. I didn't answer. What could I possibly say? Her actions had already made it clear where I stood in her life. When she finally left, the house didn't just feel empty, it felt foreign, like it wasn't mine anymore. Her absence was everywhere, not just in the cleared-out closet or the empty bathroom shelves, but in the overwhelming quiet that filled every corner. The silence wasn't just stillness, it was heavy. It pressed down on me, magnified by every creak of the floorboards, every hum of the refrigerator. The emptiness was deafening. The days that followed were a slow unraveling. She never outright said her dream life was falling apart, but the signs were impossible to miss. She began venting about small things, petty arguments over nothing, growing tension about money, and, most strikingly, the realization that her so-called dream man wasn't everything she'd built him up to be. "He's not as patient as I thought," she admitted in a late-night message. "We've been fighting a lot. I guess I didn't see it before." Every confession landed like a double-edged sword. On one side, it felt like validation, proof that she'd made a mistake. On the other, it reopened wounds I was still trying to heal. A part of me wanted to be smug, to throw out an "I told you so," even though I never had. But a bigger part of me just felt sad, not for her, but for the mess this all represented. She'd thrown away everything we had built together for a fantasy, only to discover that reality doesn't care about fantasies. As the days passed, the cracks in her dream life became more obvious. She started sharing more details about her dream man. She talked about how he was increasingly critical, how he didn't live up to the pedestal she'd placed him on. The man she left me for wasn't the caring, attentive partner she thought she'd found. Instead, he was demanding, dismissive, and, at times, downright cruel. "I feel like I'm walking on eggshells," she confided one night. Hearing those words from her was surreal. This was the same woman who had been so confident in her decision to leave, who hadn't even paused to consider what she was throwing away. Now, she was grappling with the fallout of choices she couldn't take back. But even as I felt a sense of vindication, there was no joy in it for me. I'm not the kind of person who finds pleasure in someone else's suffering, not even when that person caused me so much pain. What stayed with me most was her tone. Gone was the confidence, the assuredness she had when she walked away. Now, her voice was uncertain, almost fragile, like she was realizing she'd made a terrible mistake but didn't know how to fix it. And while part of me wanted to shut her out entirely, to let her deal with the consequences of her actions on her own, another part of me couldn't quite look away. After all, this was the woman I had loved, the one I once thought I'd spend the rest of my life with. Even though she'd shattered those promises, a small part of me still found it hard to completely ignore her pain. But I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't going to be her rescuer. Not this time. She had made her bed, and now she had to lie in it. This wasn't the dream she'd imagined, this was reality, and there was no escaping it. After weeks of sporadic messages filled with hints of regret, the moment I'd been half expecting finally arrived. She called me. Not a text. Not a casual comment on social media. An actual phone call. When her name lit up my screen, it sent a strange mix of emotions rushing through me. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity got the better of me. When I picked up, her voice, once so familiar, sounded strained, like it was on the verge of breaking. "I didn't know who else to talk to," she began, skipping over any pleasantries. Her tone was heavy, weighed down by something I couldn't quite pinpoint: fear, guilt, maybe both. "Things are harder than I expected." I stayed quiet, letting her speak. If she thought I was going to rush in and console her, she was mistaken. But I listened. She told me how her dream man wasn't just impatient and critical, he was controlling. He'd started dictating where she could go, who she could spend time with, even what she was allowed to share online. The man she left me for had become her nightmare. "It's like I'm trapped," she said, her voice trembling. "I thought I was chasing freedom, but now I feel like I've lost it completely." Listening to her say this was complicated. On one hand, I felt vindicated. Her misery was proof that I hadn't been the problem all along. But on the other hand, I felt an unexpected pang of concern. This was someone I had loved deeply, someone I'd once imagined growing old with. As much as I wanted to distance myself from her problems, it wasn't that simple. "What do you want me to do about it?" I finally asked, my voice sharper than I intended. "I don't know," she replied softly, almost like a whisper. I didn't know who else to call. Her words hit me like a sucker punch. How could she possibly think I'd be the one to understand? She had walked away from everything we built together, chased after a fantasy, and left me to deal with the wreckage she'd created. And yet, I couldn't bring myself to hang up. I stayed on the line as she shared more details about her unraveling relationship. The arguments, she said, had grown worse. The man who had once swept her off her feet now barely spoke to her without a trace of contempt. He makes me feel so small, she admitted, her voice shaking. Like I'm not good enough, like I have no power at all. The irony in her words didn't escape me. I'd felt the same way after she left, wondering where the woman I married had gone, replaced by someone who seemed like a stranger. I didn't offer her sympathy, and I certainly didn't offer advice. All I could manage was a cautious, measured response. You need to figure out what you want to do, I told her. No one can make that decision for you. She paused, like she was waiting for more, but I didn't have anything else to say. The truth was, I wasn't going to be her lifeline, not after what she'd done. If she wanted a way out of the mess she'd made, she would have to find it herself. Before the call ended, she said something that stuck with me. I thought he was my dream, she murmured, almost as if speaking to herself. But now I don't even know what that means anymore. When the line went silent, I just sat there, staring at my phone. Part of me wanted to feel victorious, like I'd won some twisted battle. But there was no triumph in this, no satisfaction to be had. All I felt was an unsettling emptiness, a hollow reminder of how much her choices had shattered both our lives. I thought that phone call was the worst of it, but I was wrong. It was only the beginning. It started subtly, like a faint hum in the background growing louder. The texts came first, followed by more calls, each one more desperate than the last. Her so-called perfect life had crumbled, and now she was trapped in a nightmare she couldn't escape. A week later, she called again, her voice shaking with panic. He's not who I thought he was, she confessed. I don't feel safe anymore. That word, safe, set off alarm bells in my mind. I wasn't sure if she was exaggerating or if things were as bad as they sounded, but the fear in her tone made it impossible to brush off. She explained how his behavior had gone from controlling to outright hostile. The temper she once dismissed as passion had become volatile and unpredictable. Every minor disagreement spiraled into shouting matches, leaving her shaken and unsure of what he might do next. He smashed a glass yesterday, she said, her voice trembling. It wasn't aimed at me, but it felt like it could have been. I clenched my jaw, trying to process what she was saying. Part of me wanted to scream at her for being so blind, for dragging both of us through this chaos. But another part, the part that still held on to a shred of empathy, just felt exhausted. This wasn't the same woman who had left me so confidently, convinced she was chasing her dream life. This was someone scared, broken, and drowning in regret. As the days passed, her calls became more frequent, and her story grew darker. She described how he twisted her words, making her doubt her own reality. He started arguments out of nowhere, accused her of things she hadn't done, and made her feel like everything was her fault. It was like she was trapped in a storm, and there was no shelter in sight. I don't even know who I am anymore, she admitted during one particularly emotional call. He makes me feel like I'm losing my mind, like everything is my fault, like I'm the one ruining everything. It wasn't easy to stay detached, emotionally or otherwise. I didn't love her anymore, not the way I once had, but hearing her like this still hurt. It was painful to see how far she'd fallen from the person she used to be. This wasn't the life she envisioned when she left me. It wasn't even close. She thought she was upgrading, chasing a dream, but instead, she'd found herself trapped in a waking nightmare. And then came the breaking point. Late one night, she called again. This time, her voice was frantic, her words spilling out in a panic that made them hard to follow. He locked me out, she sobbed. We had a fight, and he threw my things outside. I don't have anywhere to go. I froze. A dozen thoughts raced through my head. This wasn't my problem anymore. She'd made her choice, left me, left our marriage, left everything we'd built together. She was the one who walked away. But as much as I wanted to say that, to let her deal with the consequences of her actions, I couldn't bring myself to hang up. "What do you want me to do?" I asked, my voice cold and steady. "I don't know," she whispered through her tears. I don't know who else to call." Hearing her like this stirred up a storm inside me, an uneasy mix of anger, pity, and something else I couldn't quite put into words. She had destroyed me when she left. And now, here she was, crawling back, expecting me to pick up the pieces of her shattered life. But I wasn't the same person she left behind. I had learned to rebuild, to survive without her. Still, as I listened to her cry softly on the other end of the line, I couldn't ignore the raw desperation in her voice. We sat in silence for what felt like an eternity. It was a strange moment of clarity, a reminder of just how far we had drifted from the life we once shared. She wasn't the woman I had fallen in love with. And I wasn't the man who would have done anything for her. Her dream had turned into a nightmare. And now, for the first time, she was beginning to understand what she had thrown away. 2 days later, she showed up at my door. It was late evening, and I had just finished tidying up after dinner when I heard the knock. I wasn't expecting anyone, so when I opened the door and saw her standing there with a small suitcase in hand, I froze. She looked exhausted, like someone running on fumes for weeks. Her makeup was smudged, her hair a mess, and her eyes swollen and red from crying. "Can I come in?" she asked, her voice barely audible. Without a word, I stepped aside, unsure if I was making the right call but unable to leave her standing there. She stepped inside, placed her suitcase near the couch, and stood awkwardly in the living room. It was clear she didn't know where she belonged anymore, not in the home we'd once shared, not in my life. The silence was suffocating, but I didn't rush to break it. I wanted her to speak first. I needed to hear why she was really here. After a long pause, she finally sat down, her shoulders slumping as though the weight of everything she had been carrying was too much to bear. "I made a mistake," she said, her voice trembling. "I thought I was chasing happiness, but all I did was destroy the only real happiness I ever had." Her words hung in the air like a heavy fog. For a moment, I wasn't sure what to say. Part of me wanted to lash out, to let her know just how much pain she'd caused me. I wanted her to feel even a fraction of what I'd felt when she walked away without a second thought. But another part of me, the part that still held on to the memory of the good times we'd shared, couldn't bring myself to kick her when she was already down. "What do you want from me?" I asked, doing my best to keep my tone steady. "I don't know," she said, tears welling in her eyes. I needed to see you. To tell you I'm sorry. To tell you I regret everything." Her words hit harder than I expected. She looked so raw, so broken, nothing like the confident, self-assured woman who walked out of my life without looking back. And yet, here she was, sitting in front of me, her vulnerability on full display. She began to recount the full scope of what had happened with her so-called dream man. The fights, the manipulation, the control, it had all spiraled into something she couldn't escape. What had started as a fantasy had devolved into something toxic. By the end, even the illusion of love had vanished. "He's not the man I thought he was," she said, her voice trembling. "I thought I was chasing freedom, but all I did was trade one cage for another." Hearing her say this was surreal. This was the same woman who had confidently walked out of my life, convinced she was moving on to something better. Now she sat across from me, admitting that the dream she had chased had been nothing more than a lie. When she finished, she looked at me, her eyes pleading for something, understanding, forgiveness, maybe even hope. "I don't expect you to take me back," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know where else to go." Her words hung in the air, heavy with regret, wrapping around the room like a fog. I took a deep breath, my mind racing. A part of me felt an urge to comfort her, to tell her that everything would somehow be okay. But the other part of me, the one that had spent months picking up the pieces of my life after she shattered it, knew I couldn't go back. Not to what we were and certainly not to what she wanted now. I've spent months trying to put myself back together, I said, my voice steady but firm. You didn't just leave. You destroyed everything I thought I knew, about us, about myself. And now you're here, asking me to, what? Pretend it never happened? Act like it didn't tear me apart? She shook her head, tears streaming down her face. I'm not asking you to forget. I know I don't deserve that. I needed you to know I was wrong. That I see now what I threw away. Her honesty was unexpected and, in a way, disarming. But it didn't erase the pain she had caused, nor did it rebuild the trust she had so thoroughly shattered. I appreciate your honesty, I said after a moment, my tone softening. But I've moved on. I had to. You made your choice, and now I'm making mine. Her face crumpled at my words, but she nodded slowly, as though she had expected this outcome. She stayed a little longer, long enough for us to talk through some of the lingering wounds. It wasn't an easy conversation, but it was necessary. By the time she left, there was a sense of closure, not the neat and tidy kind that wraps everything up in a bow, but the kind that makes it clear there's no going back. When I closed the door behind her, I was hit with a strange mix of emotions, relief, sadness, and, most surprisingly, a sense of freedom. The house fell quiet again, but the silence felt different this time. It wasn't heavy or suffocating like it had been before. It was the kind of silence that comes when a chapter is finally, truly closed. I sat down on the couch, my eyes drifting to the spot where she had sat just minutes ago. And for the first time in what felt like forever, I realized I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't bitter or broken. I had survived. I had rebuilt. And now, I was finally free.